this. You are picture, crouched behind a weathered oak tree on the shores of a windswept fjord. The year is 793 AD, and the morning mist carries the acrid smell of burning thatch mixed with something far more terrifying. The sound of splintering wood mingles with scree once bobbed. Your heart pounds against your ribs as you witness what gnomes that echo across waters, where peaceful fishing boats Christian soul should ever see. Viking longships slice itself, their dragon pea through the grey dawn like the blades of death throes, cutting through waves stained crimson with the blood of those who dared resist. The salt air carries voices speaking a harsh tongue that sounds like wolves growling, punctuated by the metallic ring of iron against iron and the desperate pleas of women being dragged from their burning homes. This is not a tale of heroic exploration or noble conquest. This is the brutal reality of Viking raids, where the fate of captured women was sealed by customs so savage they would make even hardened warriors from other cultures recoil in horror. The longships that terrorized European coastlines for 3 centuries carried more than just weapons and warriors. They carried traditions of slavery that transformed captive bondage, ritual sacrifice, and sexual women into commodities more valuable than gold, yet treated with less dignity than livestock. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment from. I find it below to let me know where you're listening. Incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Viking understanding of captivity was fundamentally different from the Christian societies they terrorized. Where medieval Europeans saw prisoners to Christianity, Vikings saw human beings as resources of war, as potential ransoms or converts to be harvested, traded, and consumed according to ancient customs that predated Christ by centuries. Women's position in this brutal hierarchy, in particular, occupied a complex that combined economic value with religious significance and sexual exploitation in ways that created a living hell for those unfortunate enough to survive the initial raid. The selection process began during the raids themselves. Viking warriors were trained to identify valuable captives with the same cold precision they used to assess stolen silver or fine weapons. Young women of childbearing age commanded the highest prices in slave markets, but age alone was not the determining factor. Vikings prized women who displayed signs of high social status in their home communities, recognizing that nobility and wealth often corresponded with education, skills, and the kind of refined appearance that would appeal to wealthy buyers in distant markets. Astrid was perhaps 15 winters old when the dragon ships appeared off the coast of her Irish monastery in the spring of 847 AD. She had dedicated her young life to serving God, spending her days copying sacred manuscripts and tending to the herb gardens that provided medicine for the surrounding villages. Her hands, soft from a life of scholarly work rather than manual labor, marked her immediately as valuable to the Viking raiders who smashed through the monastery gates like a hurricane of iron and fury. The initial capture was designed to break the spirit as much as secure the body. Viking warriors understood that traumatized captives were easier to control during the long journey back to Scandinavian markets. They would separate women from their families deliberately, forcing them to watch as fathers, brothers, and sons were either killed outright or dragged away to different ships. The psychological torture of uncertainty, never knowing if loved ones were alive or dead, created a state of emotional devastation that made resistance seem pointless. Once secured aboard the longships, captive women entered a floating prison where every aspect of their existence was controlled by men who viewed them as cargo rather than human beings. The ships themselves were not designed for passenger comfort. Women were chained in the hull alongside barrels of water and sacks of grain, their bodies pressed against rough oak planks that had been soaked in seawater and blood from previous voyages. The constant motion of the ship, combined with poor ventilation and inadequate food, created conditions that killed the weak and left the survivors hollow-eyed and desperate. The journey to Scandinavian slave markets could take weeks, depending on weather conditions and the raiders' other objectives. During this time, captive women existed in a state of constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for the entertainment of bored warriors or sacrificed to ensure favorable winds. The Vikings practiced a form of psychological warfare against their captives that was as deliberate as their military tactics, using the threat of violence and death to maintain control while preserving their valuable human cargo for profitable sale. Sexual assault was not merely tolerated during these voyages, it was systematically employed as a tool of domination and dehumanization. Viking warriors viewed captive women as spoils of war, and the ship's hierarchy determined who had access to which prisoners. The ship's captain typically claimed first choice among the captives, followed by his most trusted warriors, with common raiders relegated to whatever women remained unclaimed. This institutionalized rape served multiple purposes beyond mere gratification. It established dominance, broke down resistance, and created a clear understanding among the captives that their bodies no longer belonged to them. The Vikings had developed elaborate justifications for these practices that were deeply rooted in their religious beliefs and cultural traditions. They worshipped gods who were themselves depicted as taking captives and slaves, and their mythology celebrated warriors who claimed women as prizes for battlefield valor. The Prose Edda and other surviving Norse texts describe a cosmos where strength determined right, and the strong had not only the ability, but the divine mandate to dominate the weak. But the horrors of the sea voyage were merely preparation for what awaited captive women in the great slave markets of Hedeby, Birka, and other Scandinavian trading centres. These bustling commercial hubs were where human misery was transformed into profit through a sophisticated network of traders, buyers, and middlemen who had perfected the art of evaluating and pricing human beings like livestock. The slave markets operated according to well-established customs that had evolved over generations of human trafficking. Captive women would be displayed naked on wooden platforms, while potential buyers examined their teeth, muscles, and reproductive organs to assess their value. The inspection process was deliberately dehumanizing, designed to reduce these women to nothing more than breeding stock or labor units in the minds of their purchasers. Different types of buyers sought different qualities in their human purchases. Wealthy farmers needed strong women who could work in the fields and bear children to expand their workforce. Craftsmen looked for women with delicate hands and good eyesight who could assist with metalworking or textile production. Ship captains sought women who could endure long voyages and serve the needs of their crews during trading expeditions that might last for months. The most valuable captive women, however, were those destined for religious sacrifice. Viking spiritual practices included elaborate rituals where human beings were killed to honor the gods, ensure good harvests, or celebrate important occasions like the death of a prominent chieftain. Women selected for sacrifice commanded premium prices not because of their physical attributes, but because of their symbolic importance in ceremonies that were believed to maintain the cosmic order. The selection criteria for sacrificial victims revealed the complex intersection of religious belief and sexual exploitation in Viking culture. Priests and priestesses who oversaw these ceremonies often required that sacrificial victims be virgins, believing that sexual purity enhanced their spiritual value. This created a perverse market for young women who had been carefully preserved during their captivity, specifically to meet the requirements of ritual murder. The archaeological evidence from sites like Trelleborg and Fyrkat reveals the systematic nature of these practices. Excavations have uncovered burial sites where multiple women were interred alongside wealthy male chieftains, their bodies showing clear signs of violent death. Chemical analysis of their bones indicates these women came from distant lands, confirming historical accounts of captives being transported across vast distances for ceremonial purposes. The economic impact of the slave trade on Viking society cannot be overstated. Human trafficking provided the wealth that funded further raids, built the great halls where chieftains displayed their power, and supported the artisans who created the intricate metalwork and jewelry that marked Viking culture. Captive women were not just victims of Viking expansion, they were the economic foundation that made that expansion possible. But the true horror lay not in the individual acts of violence, terrible as they were, but in the systematic nature of the entire enterprise. This was not random brutality or the excess of warriors drunk on victory. This was a carefully organized industry that treated human suffering as a renewable resource, harvesting misery with the same methodical efficiency that farmers harvested grain. The training programs for Viking raiders included detailed instruction on maximizing the value of human cargo through carefully calculated cruelty. Young warriors learned to identify signs of noble birth that would increase a captive's market price, while also mastering techniques for maintaining psychological control during the long sea journeys back to Scandinavian ports. These lessons were passed down through generations like family recipes, each detail refined through centuries of human trafficking. The classification system used in Viking slave markets was as sophisticated as any modern commodity exchange. Women were sorted into categories that determined their ultimate fate with the cold precision of merchants evaluating grain or livestock. The highest tier consisted of young noblewomen whose education and refinement made them suitable for wealthy households or political marriages. These captives might find themselves sold to distant kingdoms where their foreign origins added exotic appeal to their already considerable value. The second tier included skilled craftswomen, healers, and others whose specialized knowledge could benefit their owners economically. A woman who knew the secrets of dyeing cloth or brewing strong ale might escape the worst fates that awaited less fortunate captives. But this relative safety came at the cost of complete submission to masters who viewed their skills as property to be exploited rather than talents to be respected. The third and largest category encompassed the majority of captive women, those deemed suitable only for manual labor, breeding, or the satisfaction of their owners' appetites. These women faced lives of unrelenting hardship in farmsteads scattered across the harsh Scandinavian landscape, where survival depended on there to endure conditions that would have challenged even free-born Viking women. The integration of captive women into Viking households followed patterns that had been established long before the Great Age of raiding began. Slave women occupied the lowest position in a rigid hierarchy that placed them below even the poorest free-born members of society. They owned nothing, not even their own bodies, and could be bought, sold, traded, or killed at their master's whim without any legal consequence. The daily existence of these enslaved women was shaped by customs that seemed designed to crush any remaining hope or dignity. They were forbidden from wearing the jewelry and fine clothing that marked free women, instead being clothed in rough woolen garments that immediately identified their status to anyone who saw them. Their hair was cut short or bound in styles that distinguished them from free women, creating a visual reminder of their degraded position that followed them everywhere they went. The sexual exploitation of slave women was not merely tolerated, but actively encouraged by Viking law and custom. Masters could use their female slaves for their own pleasure or loan them to guests as a form of hospitality. The children born from these unions occupied an ambiguous position in Viking society. Neither fully slave nor free, their lives determined by the whims of fathers who might acknowledge them or abandon them, depending on political or economic considerations. The religious dimensions of slavery in Viking society created additional layers of horror for captive women. Certain seasonal festivals required human sacrifice, and slave women were often selected as victims for these ceremonies. The spring festival of Disablot involved the ritual killing of women to ensure fertility and good harvests, while funeral ceremonies for important chieftains might require multiple slave women to be buried alive with their deceased masters. The preparation for these sacrificial rituals was as terrifying as the ceremonies themselves. Women selected for sacrifice would be separated from other slaves weeks or months in advance, fed special diets, and subjected to purification rituals that were supposed to enhance their spiritual value. They lived in constant awareness that their death had been scheduled and planned, creating a psychological torture that may have been worse than the physical violence that awaited them. The burial sites at Oseberg and Gokstad reveal the scale of these sacrificial practices. Archaeological evidence shows that dozens of women were killed to accompany wealthy Vikings into the afterlife, their bodies arranged around the burial ships in patterns that suggest elaborate ceremonial requirements. The violent nature of their deaths, revealed through forensic analysis, indicates that these were not willing participants in religious ceremonies, but terrified victims of systematic murder. The economic calculations that drove these practices were coldly rational. A slave woman might be worth more dead than alive if her sacrifice could secure divine favor for an important undertaking, or demonstrate a chieftain's wealth and power. The Viking concept of honor required conspicuous displays of wealth, and the willingness to kill valuable slaves purely for ceremonial purposes represented the ultimate expression of status and power. The psychological impact on surviving slave women who witnessed these sacrifices cannot be imagined. They lived with the constant knowledge that they too might be selected for ceremonial death at any moment, creating a state of perpetual terror that made resistance seem futile. The Vikings understood that traumatized slaves were more compliant, and they deliberately used the threat of sacrificial death as a tool for maintaining control over their human property. The breeding programs implemented by Viking masters represented another dimension of the systematic dehumanization of captive women. Slave women were often selected specifically for their reproductive potential, with successful breeding increasing both their value and their master's wealth. Children born to slave mothers became property of the master, creating multi-generational cycles of bondage that could persist for centuries. The treatment of pregnant slave women revealed the purely economic calculations that governed their lives. Masters might provide better food and shelter for pregnant slaves, not out of compassion, but to protect their investment in the unborn child. After birth, slave mothers might be separated from their children immediately, with infants sold to other households or raised as future slaves within the same household that enslaved their mothers. The Viking legal codes that governed slavery were comprehensive and ruthless in their protection of masters' rights, while providing no protections for the enslaved. The killing of a slave woman was treated as property damage rather than murder, with the perpetrator owing compensation to the owner rather than facing criminal punishment. This legal framework created an environment where violence against slave women was not just permitted, but actively protected by the state. The resistance efforts mounted by captive women were met with punishments designed to serve as examples to other slaves. Women who attempted to escape might be mutilated in ways that made future escape attempts impossible while preserving their ability to work. The Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for tracking runaway slaves, including the use of distinctive brands and tattoos that marked escaped slaves for recapture even years after their initial flight. The documentation of these practices in saga literature and legal texts suggests that Vikings took pride in their efficiency at managing human cargo. The sagas celebrate raiders who returned with valuable captives and describe the slave markets with the same enthusiasm reserved for successful military campaigns. This cultural celebration of human trafficking indicates that these practices were not seen as necessary evils, but as legitimate expressions of Viking superiority and divine favor. The international networks that supported the Viking slave trade extended far beyond Scandinavia itself. Captive women might be transported along trade routes that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople, passing through multiple markets where their value was assessed and reassessed according to local demand. The complexity of these trading networks rivals any modern international commerce, with the crucial difference that the commodity being traded was human suffering, transformed into profit through systematic cruelty. The seasonal patterns of Viking raiding created predictable cycles of terror for coastal communities throughout Europe. Spring brought the return of dragon ships to waters that had been frozen solid during the harsh Scandinavian winters. Captive women, who had survived their first winter in bondage, faced the horrifying possibility of being loaded onto ships once again, this time as seasoned merchandise to be traded in distant markets they had never imagined existed. The spring slave auctions in major trading centers like Kaupang and Birka drew buyers from across the known world. Arab merchants arrived with silk and silver to purchase fair-haired Scandinavian women and Celtic captives whose exotic appearance commanded premium prices in Middle Eastern markets. Byzantine traders sought skilled craftswomen who could maintain the elaborate textiles and jewelry that marked imperial wealth. Even fellow Vikings competed for the most valuable captives, understanding that ownership of beautiful slave women enhanced their own status within the rigid hierarchy of Norse society. The dragon ships that once terrorized European coastlines have long since rotted into dust, but the screams of their victims still echo across the centuries. The systematic brutality we've explored today reveals a truth more terrifying than any saga ever written. Behind the romanticized image of Viking explorers lay an industrial machinery of human suffering that transformed women into commodities through methods so calculated and cruel, they challenge our understanding of human nature itself. These were not the actions of primitive barbarians, but the deliberate choices of a sophisticated culture that elevated cruelty to an art form.